Hello there, everybody, and welcome to this special transmission of the Palomazos, which in English would translate something like the jam sessions, where we have a conversation with some of the, I can say some of my favorite authors. It can be about cinema, it can be about books, or in this particular case, actually books and comic books. And for this, I am really glad to say hello to the good old Mark Russell. How are you doing, Mark?
Doing good. Good. Thanks for having me.
No, it's a real pleasure, and I mentioned this before we started with the transmission. But I am really glad that you could join us in here because I know that you are really busy writing a lot of stuff. You have upcoming titles, but once again, thank you for taking part of your time to talk with us in here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience. I will be tackling that later, but I want to give the audience, for the people who actually don't know perhaps a lot about your work. You have been writing for a long time. You started actually doing some books, right?
Yeah, my first book was a retelling of the Bible called God is Disappointed in You, in which I condensed every book of the Bible down to 2 or 3 pages each and just sort of retold it in my modern vernacular. It's sort of like, the way I like to think of it is me explaining the Bible to a friend at a bar. So it's kind of explained in that sort of just very common, sort of friendly vernacular, the way I would talk to a friend.
Exactly, and that's actually one of the things that I believe it makes it more friendly for the reader because, you know that pretty much all the sacred books are a little bit harder to read. If you have tried to read, I don't know, the Quran, I believe that the only book that is actually easy to read is the Bible of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which I must say that I am actually a preacher of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, so yeah. I know about that.
A man of the cloth. Man of the pasta.
There you are. Ramen, my brothers. So, and actually, as I mentioned, and I did by these books, I really love, I was talking to Mark before, I really love the format, but it's actually... when somebody asks me what I'm reading and I'm reading this, is like, okay, pick a page and pick any phrase and it probably will catch your attention. And it's part of the great job that you do, not only in this book, but in pretty much the rest of the things that I have read written by you, because it's really easy, it's really friendly. And actually, I wish that we had this kind of books in, I don't know, in Sunday school. So, man.
Well, great. Thank you. That all sounds very, very flattering. That's a very common part of my writing philosophy, is to try to say as much as I can in as little of a space as I can, to try to hook somebody or to hit them with what I've got in as quickly as possible. I try to have something on each and every page that's going to form a connection with the reader. Because I understand people don't have the time to wade through 20, 30 pages of something hoping there's going to be a payoff. That, and I just feel like if the more condensed, the more direct your writing is, the better it's going to be. George Saunders has this quote, which I really love, where he says, "Humor is the truth quicker than you expected it." And so I think that when you write quick, when you write things shortened and condensed, they naturally just sort of become funnier. And so it's kind of it helps when you're trying to write something funny to keep it short and succinct.
Exactly, and actually, that's you can see reflected that in your books, particularly in your comic books. I believe that two series that actually have been making the rounds about some of the most relevant texts that actually criticize, but in a very particular way, American culture, are the Flintstones and also Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles. And particularly about the Flintstones, I was checking some of the information, and you can find this in IO9, for example. And they mentioned that one of the keys is actually what you mentioned, because you are hitting the people with humor, which makes it easier for the reader in this case to actually talk about some of the different topics. And let's talk now about the Flintstones, because... first of all, I love the reinterpretation that you have about the characters, because you are keeping the core values, the core personalities from them, but you are updating them to the modern times, and you actually added some of the inventions, because they didn't have the cell phones, but now they have the shell phones, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So And I remember that looking at some of the pages, let me just see if we can load some here. You do very sharp criticism about modern times, about the way that we are just buying stuff. Where did the idea, or how did it came to you, the pitch for this series?
Well, when they approached me, and they approached me asking me if I'd be interested in writing the Flintstones, and I was a little skeptical at first because I wasn't really a big fan of the Flintstones. I didn't really enjoy it or remember enjoying it that much when I was a kid. But I kind of came around and decided to say yes and write it, just because I figured that no matter what I'm writing, as long as I can write about the things that I want to write about in the world around me, it doesn't really matter what the title is or who the characters are. But I quickly found in writing the Flintstones that I formed a very deep relationship to the characters in the town of Bedrock. In a lot of ways, made it kind of stand-in for all human civilization and for the world as I experienced it growing up here in the United States.
And it's interesting because, as you mentioned, well, it's a way that tackle, in this case, the history of a civilization from the very beginning. We could say that, but also it's so relevant even nowadays, because you can see certain aspects that perhaps will be more related to sci-fi. In science fiction, you can criticize what you have in this case in your current culture, but because you are placing the story far away in space, it's easier for the reader to actually to find that criticism not so hard on himself. And I believe that you actually did this, but not going to the future or to the space, but actually to the distant past.
Yes, that's exactly right. The key to getting someone to think about what they're doing and what's going on in their country or in their society is to first get them to not be defensive. And I think the best way to do that is to put it in a different time and place so that they're not being forced to laugh at themselves or see themselves as the butt of the joke. They're being allowed to laugh at somebody else in a different place, but then to start thinking about the ways in which the situation they're laughing at parallels their own. And hopefully in that way, that sort of indirect approach, getting them to like critically think about what needs to be changed in their own world. It's one of the most influential books I ever read was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. I read that when I was 12 years old, and it changed my life because it really is just a satire of the United States, particularly as it relates to racial segregation and westward expansion. But because he said it on Mars, it was okay. People didn't read it as like as they would like an essay in the New York Times. He would have gotten burned at the stake if he'd actually just said these things without putting it on Mars. But even as a 12-year-old, it wasn't lost on me that he's exposing some deep fissures in our history and in our society. And yet it was incredibly entertaining, and it didn't just work as social commentary, it worked as a good work of fiction. In a way, that's kind of set the template for my career. That's exactly what I wanted to do with this work and what I try to do in comics in general.
And it's interesting because, as you mentioned, perhaps it has become, I don't know, like I don't know if it's like a signature of your writing style, but it's something that if they announce a new title, in this case written by you, I am expecting perhaps something like that. And when they announced the renewed titles for the Vertigo line on DC Comics, it was kind of funny because for me it was sort of I don't know, like a continuation of your previous work, or perhaps a combination of both. We already mentioned the God is Disappointed in You, and yes, of course it has a sequel, Apocrypha Now, in here, so you can also get it. As you can see, I am sort of a fan. And they announced the title, and the name is Second Coming, and I'm going to share the announcement from DC. It's Second Coming from writer Mark Russell. God is Disappointed in You and the Flintstones, with art by Richard Pace from Imaginary Friends, will debut in 2019. And we have the phone in there, but don't worry.
My apologies.
It's okay, don't worry. And in this, it says that God sends Jesus to earth in hopes that he will learn the family trait from the Son Man, an all-powerful superhero who is like the varsity quarterback son God never had. But upon his return to earth, Christ is appalled to discover what has become of his gospel and vows to set the record right. So actually, for me at least, it seems like a continuation from your books, but in a comic book format in this case. Is that correct, or I'm just imagining things?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I feel like each one is different in a way, and this one will be its own unique story and its own unique universe. But it's also the same in the sense that it's me trying to come to terms with the world around me and the things I've grown up with and the misgivings I've had about the world I've inherited. In a lot of ways, it's also sort of a commentary about comic books in general, because I think the sort of deeply embedded ideology of comic books, in particular superhero comics, is that violence is the solution to every problem. That you just need somebody with enough strength to beat everybody up and everything's going to be good. They will eventually prevail and solve the world's problems. Whereas in reality, only a tiny percentage of the human race's problems can be solved by throwing somebody through a plate glass window or punching them until they're unconscious. All the rest of the problems need to be solved either with science, or technology, or empathy, compassion. And so this is really an examination of the limits of power, about how there's only so many problems that can be solved by somebody with super strength who can fly, and the rest need to be solved by just a different way of approaching fellow human beings. And that's kind of what Christ represents. This is his second coming. He comes back to earth and wants to see how well his philosophy of forgiveness and compassion has worked out as an alternative to violence and revenge, as a means of keeping social order, and is horrified to discover that not only has violence and revenge won out, it's actually co-opted him. He is now like the standard bearer. He's on people's t-shirts and he's on the fronts of mega churches that are preaching this very sort of like imperialistic violence that he not only spent his life trying to escape, but that ultimately killed him during his first visit on Earth. And so in a way, the Romans ultimately won because they just co-opted him.
And it's interesting because I remember that in writing classes, one of the things that our teacher at the time mentioned that some of the easiest characters that will help you to develop a story is to take someone who is well known. And in this case, Jesus Christ is one of the references because you pretty much don't have to explain the background. However, it allows you to, in this case, explore different aspects that perhaps weren't questioned before, different aspects that nobody was wondering about. So perhaps we have, I don't know, Chosen by Mark Millar, which is a title that actually talks about the second coming. But in this case, you are focusing on something different. And you mentioned one thing that it's actually what I consider really important in this case in your writing, in your titles, and it's the empathy in the characters. Going back to the Flintstones, and I'm going to share one of the pages. There is some commentary that Fred is looking at on the TV, and they mentioned that pretty much the difference between the people, the cavemen that are outside, and how savages they are, and the relative to wealth and tranquility that is in society. And I love the way that you are showing this, because you are not actually doing a criticism, in this case, of a mythical figure of the caveman, the prehistoric caveman, and how the next generation, in this case, people who are represented by Fred and Vilma, and they are more civilized, but they actually are like, well, there are questions that perhaps we are not willing to ask even to ourselves. However, we are not here to criticize. So they establish a pattern of in this case of empathy. And also it's kind of funny. I remember that I saw this framing here where Fred and Barney are taking some of the strong men in there because I believe that they were going to be hired, and they are showing them around, and Barney just mentioned, hey Fred, did you know there's a bunch of cavemen in cars? And once again, I see the empathy in here, the criticism perhaps about some other people that they are pretty much just like us. So it's kind of interesting. And also in the other title that we're going to mention in here, you put it very well because, man, and I mentioned this before, in the case of Snagglepuss, you actually made a heartfelt story in there with the different characters. I can say this, that you made me cry with pretty much the lost issues, because I really care about the characters in there. And once again, you can create that because you have empathy with the reader.
Yeah, I think that really the soul of good writing is empathy. The hard thing about writing and writing a story that's going to relate to the reader is learning to care for the characters that you're writing, and then being willing to do horrible things to them so that the reader will be destroyed by the same things that are destroying you as a human being, the same sort of prejudice and mindless violence and pettiness that destroys me. I try to have destroy my characters so that I can let the reader feel what I'm feeling. And it's hard because you're ultimately hurting people, but you're hurting people in a way that makes them feel closer together, makes them feel like they're part of a movement together, which I think is ultimately why people read. They want to feel like they're part of the universe that's larger than themselves. They want to feel a connection to other human beings. I think people ultimately want to be moved, and it doesn't really matter in which direction. They just want to read something or see something that's just going to move them in some direction, because it makes them feel connected to the people that are moving them.
Exactly. And for example, in the Snagglepuss title, I believe that there's a dialogue. Don't quote me in here, but I will try to remember the meaning in here. But you establish the difference in the case of actors. The difference when you have a star and when you have an actor, because a star is a person that you aspire to be like. However, a real actor, in this case, they have the reference in theater, is somebody who actually shows you how you are. Entonces,
right.
That's interesting, sorry.
And I think that's also kind of true in writing, that I think it's dangerous to rely on stars or on sort of iconography that shows these aspirations of, who we imagine ourselves to be or who we want to be. I think just as much as that, we need someone to show us who we really are, someone to show us what we're doing wrong. And I feel like that's kind of my role in writing these things, is to show us the ways in which our institutions are failing us and the way they could do better.
And one question before we go to some of the questions from the audience is that you mentioned before that they approach you for writing the Flintstones in this case. And I believe that perhaps you could actually tell that you could have told that story with some different characters. However, it really worked really well, and you already mentioned that you just adapted some of the concepts in this case. But in the case of Snagglepuss, you think you could have written that story with some completely different characters, or the fact that you were using Hanna-Barbera characters was part in the way that you approached the story?
Well, the Hanna-Barbera characters kind of created the story. The story did not exist until I knew that I was writing Snagglepuss. But then once I had agreed to write Snagglepuss, it got me to thinking about the character and about his backstory. And just based upon the little we know about the character from the cartoons, we could kind of figure out that he's probably gay. In fact, he's become a gay icon. So I'm starting from the assumption that he's gay. And yet he obviously can't be open about it because his cartoons were in the 1960s. And in fact, in the cartoon series, he had a girlfriend, Lila Lyon. So that told me the next part of the story was that she will be his beard, his sort of marriage arrangement, so that people don't suspect him. And then it got me to thinking, because his two catchphrases, "Heavens to Murgatroyd" and "Exit Stage Left," are both theater references. He must have had a background in theater. He must have been doing something in theater before he got into cartoons. So that informed the largest part of the story, is, well, what was he doing in theater, and what would it have been like to be a closeted gay lion working in theater in the 1950s in the United States. And so that, of course, brought in the elements of the Lavender Scare and the Red Scare and the Cold War, the backdrop of the paranoia about the Soviet Union and the arms race. So starting with Snagglepuss, the rest of the story just kind of unfolded on itself. It's not like I had this great story I wanted to tell about the Cold War and then just dropped it on Snagglepuss. It's that Snagglepuss really was the genesis of this whole story and how it unfolded.
And actually, one of the questions that we have from the audience, un saludo al buen Carmix. I'm just saying hello to Carmix. They actually did a review about the entire Snagglepuss run, titled in their podcast in El Café Comiquero, the comic book cafe. And one of the questions that he had for this, for you actually, is that if you had in mind before the title was released that it was going to be actually canon, it was going to be part on continuity for Hanna-Barbera.
Yeah, I'd always meant for this to be an explanation of how Snagglepuss got to the point where he became a Hanna-Barbera cartoon character. In a way, it became sort of an origin story, but I wanted to leave that to the last issue to be sort of like something that drops on the audience. Like they suddenly realize that in a way, I think it gives it more of an impact. Like this actually happened. It references not only real events in history, but real events in Snagglepuss's life as a fictional character. So it leaves people with that lingering sense of reality.
Yeah, and for example, that's what happens when you finish the reading, because it's like all the elements that you actually were having before with the different characters, a horse that it's in the police force. You start seeing how they develop, and they are going to fit in the continuity after that. But we were just wondering if it was the plan from the beginning, which you pretty much say that yes, it was going to be part of that. And we have some questions from the audience. Daniel Kenobi is asking you about. I'm going to translate because it is in Spanish. If you knew that a dragon, the creature that Lovecraft uses in one of his story, is the god that was worshipped by the enemies of Sanson. This is probably a reference for the time that you were writing God is Disappointed in You. So were you aware that dragon was used by Lovecraft and was the figure that the Philistines were worshipping back there?
I was aware that the Philistines worshipped Dagon. I had no idea that it was used by Lovecraft. So that's news to me. But yeah, I knew the biblical background of Dagon. And in fact, there's a moment where God Almighty and Dagon sort of face off against each other after the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. They drag it back to the Temple of Dagon. And so God is not too pleased being a guest in Dagon's house. And so he starts infesting the Philistines with boils and rats and cancer. And then they figure out that this is God's wrath. So they put the Ark of the Covenant on like a cart pulled by some oxen and just lead it out of town. And as an apology to God, they actually filled these sacks up with sort of golden figurines of tumors and rats. It's like like acknowledging that this plague of rats and cancer came from God, which seems like a really weird way to sort of commemorate and apologize to God. It'd be like, if somebody punched you out, you sent them a picture of your black eye. It's like, this is how you were, congratulations, you got me. But apparently that's what the Philistines did. I don't know, the ancient world was a little different. Anyway, I'm rambling on about Dagon. I know that's not really the point of your question.
No, don't worry, but it's kind of interesting because, it's a way to make you feel guilty before, just by showing you the consequences of something that's about to happen. Or
one thing is, I think, a lot different about the ancient world than our world is that, we feel guilty for having injured somebody or having sort of been the aggressor. They felt guilty for being weak. They felt guilty for, you really killed us. We're so sorry. They apologized for being the victims back then.
Yeah, it's a different way, and as you mentioned, it's like if you show something that meant weakness, it's like you were lost in there. Well, some different questions that we have from Richard Grayson in this case, Nightwing. He asks, have you received harsh criticism about some sensitive themes such as gay marriage from the fans, or have them embraced the kind of treatment on such old characters, in this case like in the Flintstones?
Overall, they've embraced it a lot. I've been really pleased with the response it's gotten and how well people have understood what I'm trying to do with these characters. And there's always some, usually in like the right wing media, there's some somebody writing an article, and one of my favorite comments was the right-wing media posted a picture of Snagglepuss when it was first announced, and he was kissing his boyfriend, and it was accompanying this article in Breitbart. And one of the commenters said he said that pink lion better not be a boy, which I thought was hilarious. He didn't care about the bestiality element at all. He just wanted it to be a girl lion. Then he could handle it. But yeah, to me, it's like when they complain about it, it's almost better satire than I could do writing about them. So
yeah, it kind of, I don't know, it actually surpasses or the expectations that perhaps you can have about the criticism that you will be making about here. Going back to Snagglepuss, what kind of research did you do? Because you include a lot of historic characters in this case. We have reference from a famous blonde, or we have reference for different political figures in there. And you are, you are tackling a difficult time, difficult period in American history. Remember, we had the witch hunt, and where they were pretty much attacking everything that was anti-American, un-American in this way. And one of the things was the gay community. And I just love the way that you portrayed the reality through, once again, cartoon characters in this case. So what kind of research did you do about the characters or the events that you are actually including in the story?
Yeah, well, I really wanted it to exist in a very historically plausible way. So I did a lot of research just to make sure that the timeline generally worked. The things I was putting in the story in 1953 actually were taking place in 1953. I mean, sometimes I had to fudge a little if they weren't, happening, in the order in which events happened, but I usually tried to limit it to historical events that actually happened in 1953, especially as it pertained to the development of the hydrogen bomb and the House Un-American Committee's hearings and the revolution in Cuba. I wanted those to exist in a historically plausible universe, so I was very careful to make sure that it worked. It generally worked with the dates I was using.
Interesting. And as you mentioned, you have the revolution in Cuba, which is kind of interesting because in Cuba you have first a revolution, then you have the counter-revolution, which is when the Castro brothers came to power, and you tackled there with who was once the boyfriend in this case of Snagglepuss, if I remember correctly. We have some more questions from the audience, and they mentioned Laura Berbejo. She's a big fan of the Flintstones comics, and in this case, she asked about the Snagglepuss comics if you have received some support or criticism from the LGBT community.
Yeah, the LGBTQ community has been, in general, very, very supportive. They've embraced it, much more so with Snagglepuss, I think, because this is, like I said before, an icon of their community. So I very much wanted to get this right. I did not want it to feel like cultural appropriation or that I was somehow making light of the struggles of LGBTQ people in the past. So I really wanted to get this right. And I was very relieved when, some of my best reviewers, some of the people that were the biggest supporters of this comic were from the LGBTQ media.
Mm-hmm. And also, for example, you tackle these kind of topics in the Flintstones. I remember that you actually took the literal. That there is a reference that there weren't Adam and Eve, but it was Adam and Steve, and you actually took that literally, but add some meaning that I just love, because the explanation in this case that Fred gives about the importance. He's having this discussion with one of the religious leader, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, and he was asking Fred, like, what is the value of this kind of people if they cannot reproduce? And Fred gives a lovely explanation that actually gets personal, because thanks to the community in this case, well, you have the community surviving. So, well, I mean, it's really good in this the way that you tackle. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like most prejudice is really based upon a poor understanding of history. That because the human population has grown so much, and since the advent of agriculture, our emphasis has been on populating and multiplying and growing more farm labor to keep society going. We stopped valuing people who didn't contribute to that. But we forget that before that, for 95% of the human race's history, we were hunter-gatherers, when we owed our survival to people who weren't propagating, but who were able to lend a hand in taking care of the children that we had, because we were constantly on the move. And without the extra adults to help out with the children, we probably would have died out as a species. And I feel it's the same way, when you see these white supremacists talking about, like why European countries are more advanced than African countries or whatnot. They're really only able to grasp about 300 years of human history, of a history that's gone back about 120,000 years. And I think if they understood that most of human history lies, when we were these small tribes of hunter-gatherers who absolutely relied upon every member of the tribe, old, young, breeding, not breeding, to survive, I think it would make it a lot harder for them to justify in their own mind devaluing certain groups of people as somehow less deserving to share space on the earth.
Interesting. And as we mentioned before, after all, you are part of the community, and we all have a part to play in this case, not only for the survival of the species, but also something that you use at the end. I love the speech that Snagglepuss is giving before Congress, because he actually mentioned something that it can be like like really superfluous, in this case the entertainment industry, and he mentions that it actually has a value because it represents something and something that we can follow, something that we can believe, something that actually can distract us. But if we don't have this, you can actually get into a more, I don't know if I can say it, a horrible way to tackle the reality. Some cases it can be politics, or some cases it can be personal fixation. So it also mentions in this way that you have different aspects, not only different kind of peoples, that helps you in this case to have a better understanding of culture in this case.
Yeah, I think that human beings are fanatical by nature. And as we discussed earlier, we all want to feel a connection to a larger reality. We all want to feel like we belong to some greater movement. And the more things we have available to people to give them that sense of belonging, art, music, literature, the more they're going to find the thing that works for them, and the more benign their life is going to be. The more you limit those things down, you take away art, you take away music, you take away literature, you take away pop culture, all that really leaves them is really poisonous ways for them to feel connected. They're going to pour themselves entirely into political ideology, like wanting to, or their racial identity, or religious fundamentalism. And so I think by creating these sort of like productive artistic ways for people to feel connected to the world around them and to other human beings, you create avenues for this fanaticism to go, so that they don't feel the only way to really feel connected part of a movement is to go to war, or to try to or terrorism, or trying to convert the rest of the human race to their worldview. The more you take away the other things besides their worldview to get excited about and to pour themselves into, the more violent and fundamentalist a world you're creating. And that was kind of the point I was making with that, because the counterpart, of course, was the Soviet Union, where, because there was no real show business, the state became show business. And that's, I think in a lot of ways, it's what you see in the United States now. The state is becoming show business, and it's incredibly dangerous. We're becoming a nation of cult members because of it.
And it's interesting. I will mention something similar, because it has also happened in different countries. We can see in Italy, when we have Berlusconi, who was like a media mogul in that country, and he was a president. He actually ran recently for a position. Luckily, he didn't win. At least in Mexico, right now we're having elections, and we see a lot of people who are candidates for city mayor or for other positions, but the only background that they had before is that they were famous. We have football players with, well, of course, you can be a football player and you can be really good at politics. That's not the discussion. But when you see that the only skill that they had is that they were well known, you see that the parties actually were trying to contact them and use their image. The same happens with different kind of actors, actresses, and well, we don't have to mention, but obviously that has some influence in the American elections, not only with the current president, but also with some people like The Rock, in this case, who has been actually mentioned that perhaps he would run for a position. And to be quite honest, if I was an American citizen, perhaps I could vote for him because he's really charismatic. I don't know.
Yeah, or Oprah talking about running for president.
There you are.
And I think that, you know, there's this sort of twisted logic where people think, well, if a bad celebrity made a bad president, like Trump does, then maybe a good celebrity will make a good president. And it's scary because in a way it feels like we've entered into this, what I call this post-competency era of political rule. This idea that you don't actually need to know things. You don't actually need to have developed skills in government. You don't actually need to know how government or how the bureaucracy works in order to rule. And it's this incredibly dangerous idea. And it's one that's bigger than the United States. Obviously, you got Duterte and the Philippines. And it's just the idea that strong convictions or believing you know what to do somehow could take the place of actual competency, which is, you know, I think what resonated with Donald Trump for a lot of Americans was not that they believed he was, you know, knew what he was doing so much as he seemed really sure of himself. And that's what they responded to. And it's incredibly dangerous because I think that the more sure you are of yourself, probably the less you actually understand what's going on in the world around you. And this can only go on for so long before somebody makes a horrible mistake that ends in a war or the collapse of a major institution that we rely upon for life today. And you don't have to look too far. I mean, if you live in Puerto Rico, you're experiencing that right now about how the post-competency era of American government has directly affected their lives.
And that's one of the sad examples because, for example, they haven't recovered, and it's kind of interesting because it's some sort of well, if you actually heard podcasts from Marketplace, I love the analysis that they do in the economical aspects, and they mention in this case the how the people from Puerto Rico feels about you have the contrast between you're feeling part of in this case of the American country. Of the Americas, but then you see the reaction that you have from different elements of the government, and it's sort of a struggle because perhaps it's not what we were expecting, or perhaps it's not what we deserve it, but well, that's a different topic. Let's go back a little bit about the comic books, which is actually what we want to distract ourselves in this case, in this situation. And we have more questions from the audience. Richard Grayson, Nightwing, Nightboy, ask nice. Us. If you were to write a superhero comic book, what would be your dream job? In which company and which character would you like to work and why? And before you answer, you have already worked in Superman, if I'm not mistaken, right? You have written a couple of stories for the Action Comics and the Superman specials that were released like a couple of months ago, right?
That's correct. I had a couple of backup stories in the Action Comics special #1 and the other special that came out this summer, just a couple short 10-page stories. But in a way, that kind of answers my question. If I could write any superhero, it would probably be Superman, just because I feel like, in a way, he's got all this power, and the fact that he can keep it in check and not use it to rule the world or to just go crazy and kill people is, to me, really profound. I feel that, in a way, his real superpower is not flying or super strength. It's being able to do all those things and yet keep it in check, keep himself together. That's his actual superpower, and I find that endlessly fascinating. I think most comic books are a sort of a meditation on power and how it should be used. But I think Superman, in a lot of ways, is a meditation on how power should not be used. And so I find him really fascinating. I also would would really love a chance to write a Swamp Thing story, just because I feel like it could be a really good sort of metaphor for writing about what I think is happening ecologically to the Earth.
There you are. It's kind of funny because both characters are on DC Comics. I know that you have a lovely relationship with them, so but don't worry. You can be honest. We can talk about this in Spanish, and you can tell us if you want to work with El Santo, a Mexican wrestler, or something like that. Don't worry, they are not.
I would totally take somebody up on that. I actually am writing one non-DC character right now, which I've always kind of wanted to write. I'm writing a short Judge Dredd series.
Ah, that's correct. Yeah. I remember that I saw that, and actually, it's quite the opposite of what you have, what you can write with Superman. So it's interesting.
Yeah, and the thing that's really appealing about it to me is that Mega City One is such a great world to be writing in, and in a lot of ways feels like what we'll probably be living in about 100 years. It doesn't feel terribly science fiction-y to me. It feels like this is probably close to the truth of where we will be soon. But I wanted to write a story about this poor city block called the Patrick Swayze block. It's on the outskirts of Mega City One. And it's really a story about, how a society can only neglect poor people. It can really only neglect anybody in the society for so long before it comes back to haunt them. And there's really no such thing as people people you can leave behind, or people that you can just sort of not think about that. A society can only function when it takes care of everybody within the society. Otherwise, it's just creating the thing that will destroy the society later on.
All right, so there you have. That's a different take that we can have, and I have to reread once again the character, because I believe that since the movie, the Dread movie, which I really love the way that they did the last one, I haven't read anything about the character, so this actually give me the excuse to once again read it.
And it's in a lot of ways kind of my response to the movie, because the movie, I like you, I thought was great, but it's mostly about these two judges sort of having to shoot up everybody who lives in this building, and everybody in the building is completely unsympathetic, and it's really about the police force as being this game of whack-a-mole against the citizens. And so what I wanted to do was have like a situation where Judge Dredd and Judge Beanie, who are the two judges in my story, are in a similar situation where they're in a building that's been taken over, but they actually have to make an alliance with the people who live there. They have to make an alliance, especially with the criminal gang who have all the guns that are holed up in the city block to stave off a mutant invasion, and to show like the actual people living there can also be heroic too. Heroism is not something that you need to rely upon the state to provide.
There you are, and actually that will be as you mentioned, it's sort of a response. And now I can see why the stories that you wrote about Superman. Well, they didn't tackle this specific topic, but it's something that it's some sort of the main theme about Superman, because he helps us to aspire to be better, to work in community, which is something that you mentioned in this story. So,
yeah, the thing that's really wonderful about Superman is that he's got all the power in the world, and yet violence is like the smallest tool in his belt. He only resorts to it when absolutely necessary.
Exactly, and the Superman titles have been having an awesome run from Dan Jorgens, from Tomasi. Right now, Bendis is actually doing awesome. But I want Bendis to keep writing. I want Tomasi to keep writing the character. But you have a different topic and a different perspective that make me miss the times in the 90s where you actually had 4 titles for Superman. So perhaps you could be writing the theater of the four writers. So that would be great.
I would definitely take number 4.
All right. So we're pretty much about to finish the transmission. We have one final question, or actually a request. If you could talk to us, tell us a little bit about something that for me was a surprise, because it's going to be an adaptation from the comic book that came from the cartoon. And what are we talking about? We're talking about the Snagglepuss Chronicles. There's going to be a presentation in Philadelphia, and it's going to be on September, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And can you tell us about what is going on in here? Because it took me by surprise the way that you're going to what they are presenting, because you are going to have a reading, right? Or what is going to be this about?
Yeah, they're doing a dramatic reading of the comic, the Snagglepuss Chronicles, at the Tennessee Williams Play Festival, which tickles me pink, so to speak, because, you know, this is like Snagglepuss is based on Tennessee Williams, and it's giving this work a level of literary respect I never thought I would actually achieve. So I'm very happy with this.
All right, so there you have it. It will be the tickets are actually available right now. You can get the tickets, the passes, plan your visit for what I am reading here, and you can just check it. Pretty much, just I will add the link in the show notes for this in case that you are interested. You are in Philadelphia and you can attend in here. So pretty much we're finishing this section, Mark. If people want to contact you, I believe that it's really easy to do it if they use some of those social network sites, right?
Yeah, that's really the best way to contact me. That's where I am active most of the time. And everything I'm doing, I just sort of update on social media. And I do a lot more on social media than I do in any other site. So probably just best to follow me on Twitter.
There you are. You can find him in Twitter as Manruss, Manruss. And it's a really nice guy. And actually, well, of course, he's a really nice guy. He's sharing his time with us. And, well, you can just send him some tweets in here. So with this, we're pretty much finishing the transmission in here. Mark, thank you very much for your time and for your knowledge. I mentioned this before, and I once again want to mention it because you're one of the most, I believe that one of the most relevant voices that we have in here. I am really glad that I got the chance to read some of your material, and I believe that you will be killing it with the titles that you are going to be writing next, because, man, you have one of those voices that we actually need. So, as we mentioned, to establish empathy, and, man, you're just a really good writer. So that's...
Oh, well, thank you. That's very nice. I wish we lived in a time where the writing wasn't so relevant.
Well, but you will be doing something else, and it will be
That's
also
true.
be relevant. So.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, and for all the people who is watching us live, remember that tomorrow we will be having the downloadable audio version of this show. You can still watch it on all the sites that we are in YouTube and Facebook and on Periscope. And if you like this kind of talks that we have, remember that you can support us. We have the, how can I say it? We have like the tips jar. And you can contact us or just support us using Patreon in patreon.com/Churros y Palomitas, which is the name of this site. And we thank a lot of the help that has been bring to us by your patrons. Mark, once again, thank you for your time, and hope we can talk later about another title, or perhaps just chatting.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you, Dan. This has been a pleasure.
All right, and here are the end credits. Thank you, everybody, for watching us.